G'day everyone. So if you're new to my channel, I make knives professionally. And when I say professionally, I don't mean as a hobby. I don't do it on weekends. I make my entire living making knives. It's my entire world. I support my family on my knives. But one of my favorite things to do as a knife maker when I come inside at the end of a long day is watch one of my all-time favorite TV shows, Forged in Fire. And if you're into knives and you're watching my channel, you've probably heard about Forged in Fire. I love it. I think it's a great show. But I do a lot of work in the, you knew there was a but coming. I do a lot of work in the education sector for knife making and blacksmithing, and co-host a podcast, the Forgecast, where I listen to a lot of questions and answer a lot of questions from beginner bladesmiths. And one thing that I hear a lot, sort of on repeat really, is people have gotten into knife making because of Forged in Fire, and they get a lot of their education about knife making from watching Forged in Fire. And I do take exception to that because Forged in Fire is an awesome show. It's wild, it's fun, it's you know, you laugh, you cry, you cringe sometimes when people have horrible failures happen in that. It's wonderful to watch. But one thing that it is not is an educational program. And I see all of the time people say, I saw this on Forged in Fire, and thus I'm assuming it must be the right way to do things. Now, there's a caveat to this, and there's a big disclaimer that I want to put on this video. This video is not a shot at Forged in Fire, because I see Forged in Fire for what it is. It's an entertainment program, not an educational program. I also see that what the knife makers that are on the show are asked to do is ludicrously hard. To make high-layer Damascus knives that are like a foot long in 3 hours is a huge task, which means in order to fit the work into that short time frame, you need to cut corners, you need to do things sometimes not the correct way. And in addition to all of this, they are working in a confined space that has 4 triple burner forges running all at the same time under intensely bright studio lights. So you'd be sweating, you'd be overheating, you'd be getting exhausted from running around so much. The stress of the situation with the countdown timer going, as well as not being able to judge colors properly and things because of the intense lighting. It's an insane setting to be in, but that's what makes the show exciting, right? So because of this sort of adverse conditions that they are put in, they do cut corners sometimes. So the things that I wanted to do in this video was to highlight some of the things that I have seen on the show that I have then seen reflected in the community with people doing it that way. Now, I'm not going to talk about things that are done simply because the people are rushing. That's fair game. You know, if you're rushing, you're going to do things a certain way. But a lot of the competitors on the show will out and out say this is the way this is done normally, and they're wrong. Or they'll demonstrate things that are, they clearly think that this is the way to do something, and it's not. And it's bad to put that out there, and it's not, I'm not saying this is the competitor's fault for doing this. I'm saying it's the way the show edits it. I think the people who edit the show, the way they cut it up and condense what is hours and hours of work into a short 45-minute episode, the people doing that editing don't necessarily always understand knife making, and so they may cut out and not show certain parts that are actually important to show from the perspective of somebody who's trying to learn from watching. So the short answer of this is, you know, short point of this video is don't try and get a knife making education from Forged in Fire. It's not what it's for. It's an education. It's a entertainment show, not an education show. So we're gonna, I'm not taking shots at any of the contestants. I'm not taking shots at the show. I love the show, and I know a lot of the people who have actually competed on there, and I call a lot of them friends. And so let's get into a few of the clips, and I wanted to hopefully translate some of the scenes from the show into educations.
Drawing into the tang, it's skating. It is taking way too much time, so I keep adding the oil to it, trying to lubricate it a little bit.
All right, so if you're trying to drill into steel that's been hardened, drill bits usually, there are drill bits that can do it, but most drill bits are made of high-speed steel, and they just can't drill through fully hardened steel. It's like trying to drill glass or ceramic tiles. It's about sort of that hardness. So that's why you can't get through. And as soon as you hear that squeal sound, if a drill bit's making a squeal sound, that drill bit is struggling. And if the drill bit is struggling, you need to just stop. You could push through, but you'll most likely kill the drill bit. You're also potentially putting crack risk into the steel by just bearing down on it, because drill presses don't work by pushing harder. Pushing harder does not make a drill press drill better. It's about even pressure as you're going through it. So if you hear the screech, and a lot of the contestants are really good with this, as soon as you hear the screech, you just go, okay, it's not worth going. I'm gonna run over, get a MAP gas torch, and blue the steel. And what I mean by that is heat the tang where you're going to be drilling with the MAP gas torch until you'll start seeing temper colors go across it. It helps if you grind it back a little bit so it's shiny steel first. And then you heat it, and you'll see it'll suddenly go straw gold, and then a brown color, and then a purpley color, then a blue, then a light blue, and then a kind of like a mottled gray color. Once it's mottled gray, that steel is now completely detempered and soft. That whole process you can do in about 20 seconds. If you're worried because the place you're heating is close to the blade, you can wrap the blade in a wet cloth, which you'll see a lot of contestants do. A wet cloth around steel will completely stop it being able to be detempered. So it's a really good way to sort of overcome that hurdle. But yeah, detemper it very quickly. It's literally seconds to do it. And they've got MAP gas torches in the forge, so just go for it. Then take it back to the drill press and you'll find that it works really well. One thing I also see is they use 3-in-1 oil. They give the contestants 3-in-1 oil to drill. 3-in-1 oil is not a cutting oil. It really doesn't do much on a drill press. It's better than nothing, I suppose, but tap magic, that's what you want to use. Or any sort of cutting oil. It's the right viscosity to help you drill holes. 3-in-1 oil does not do a great job at it.
I file test the blade and it skates right across, so I gotta have a perfectly hard blade.
Yeah, okay, this one bothers me every time I see it. File testing is done because when you, like I said before, when you quench a blade, it's now as hard as glass. It's very, very hard. And it's, depending on the steel, harder than a file. So if you take your blade, you need to do what's called a file test. Now, doing that does nothing. It's not a file test. Files work because they've got teeth all the way down them, and the teeth are all pointed forward. So if you're pulling, it's not doing anything. They only work on the push, and they only work when there's downward pressure applied to them. So you need to actually hold it nice and steady, or put it on your anvil or something, bear down, and that is how you file. Just doing this doesn't do anything. So if you're file testing, the point is, does the file skate? And they'll say they're looking for it to skate, which means when you actually file on it, the file won't do any damage to the steel. And you'll just feel it just slide off. But if you're going sideways, the teeth of the file aren't engaging with the steel. So when I see people do that, it's incorrect. A lot of people will say you can hear when a file skates just by going sideways, and you don't have to risk damaging the file, which is very valid. But when you are in a giant workshop with 3 other smiths all working like crazy, forges going and everything, you can't reliably use your ears to tell. So just learn to file properly. Some people seem to just wave it around like a magic wand and assume that it works. Another thing is, you need to let your blade fully cool down. A lot of people, I've seen people file test while the steel is still glowing red. I've seen it while it's still smoke billowing off it. If it's still billowing smoke, it hasn't cooled yet enough to be able to be file tested, because the quenching process of steel, of all of that hardness developing, happens during the full cool down process. You need to get it below I won't use technical terms, but below a certain temperature, and a really good indicator for that temperature is that it's not billowing smoke anymore. If it's lightly smoking, maybe. I would wait for it to fully stop smoking before I file test it. And I know time is precious, so people rush. I get it. I understand. I can relate to that. But try and let it cool. Give it a few swings through the air or something. Let it cool a bit first. And one final point of that is that not all steels, because they use a lot of scrap steel on this show, not all steel varieties that you're given can be hardened to be harder than a file. So a lot of the times a knife will have hardened, but not hard enough to not be bitten into when you do an actual proper file test. So you need to find an alternate way to test that. So working with scrap steel is a whole challenge in and of itself. And I do have a video upcoming about that, so stay tuned for that.
Oh, holy cow.
It's streaming already.
Okay, so this is a complicated one. There are techniques called interrupted quenching and the like, where what I'm about to say is not valid, but when you're in a situation of forged in fire, I would say that it's never the case that it's an interrupted quench. So when you put the knife in the oil, you don't want to pull it back out again. I've seen contestants stick it in and then pull it out and then let it air cool. I've seen contestants very slowly lower the whole thing in. I've seen people put it in and then slowly pull it out. I've even heard contestants say that I got a good fireball when I pulled it out, which means it quenched. I think that was back in like season 3 or 4 or something. Totally false. You want to put it in there nice and quick, and you want to agitate, and you want to, it's like, I always tell people, it's like drowning somebody. Put it in until the bubbles stop. That's the best way to think about it. You need to keep it in the oil to allow that full quenching process to happen. When you pull it out, it should just be at most lightly smoking. If you put it in, you pull it out, and it's a massive fireball happens, or it's billowing huge gouts of smoke, it hasn't cooled fully yet. Put it in the oil and keep it in the oil. It really doesn't take long. It's only a matter of, at most, 10-15 seconds. You're not going to be losing too much time by keeping it in there.
Fail, it'll be in the quench. And then I'll be the first one sent home.
G in the oil.
Damn. That's a warp. I gotta go back in the forge.
G's back into the forge, trying to get that warp out with heat.
That second quench, super stressful. Stress on the metal, stress on me, but it's got to be done.
Yeah, okay. So this one is one of those ones that can be put down to people just not having time, which is totally fair enough. Like, the time restrictions on Forged in Fire are deliberately ridiculous. So that's what makes the show so exciting and fun, and why I like it. But people watching it need to understand that people are going to be skipping steps. And one of the steps that you really need to do is, if you've quenched a knife and you pull it out and there's a warp, we'll get to what you do in that situation in a second, but your response should not be to stick it back in the forge, reheat it, and quench again. Or while it's hot, hammer it down and then put it back in. Every time you're putting it in there, you risk growing the grain structure of your steel to the point where it will literally it'll crumble. Big sand-like grain in your knife means you don't have a strong knife. And I have a video on why grain structure is important. I highly recommend you check that out. I'll link that up above. So you get good grain by a process called thermocycling, particularly normalization. And how you do that is a complex topic, but I'll give you the gist. You want to heat it up until decoalescence happens. The steel will become non-magnetic. You take it out and you let it cool in still air until it is cool enough to be able to touch, basically. It doesn't necessarily have to be that cool, but for sake of argument, cool enough to touch. That's a normalization cycle. And what that does is it relaxes your grain and refines it. And it's I'm glossing over a very complex topic here, but that's what you want to do. And you do see some contestants thermocycle, and some people will thermocycle by pulsing it to just above non-magnetic and then just below non-magnetic and then just above and then just below. I'm going to do that a few times. Given the tight time constraints, that would help. But quenching it, the aggressive nature of what a quench does to a blade, seeing that it's got a warp and then going straight in, heating it back up again and then quenching again. I've seen people do it like 4 times. It's not how you fix a warp. How you can fix a warp, there's 2 ways. The first is during the cooling window. You quench, you pull it out and check, see if it's got a warp. If it has, have a vise ready or with metal plates that you can clamp and put it in there and clamp it so it forces it to stretch back into a straight line. Another thing you can do is have 2 flat pieces of wood or metal in a pinch. It's better to use, I like to use wood. It's less thermally conductive. And you put it on there, put the other piece of wood and press down, put your whole body weight on it. And that can actually straighten things out quite a bit as well. If you miss that window, you've got maybe 20 seconds. On a blade that size that they usually do, it maybe 30 seconds after the quench to be able to do that. If you miss that window and you've still got a warp, you can put in a 3-pin jig and lightly apply heat with something like a map gas torch because you want to get it up to its temper temperature, which is going to be about 200 degrees Celsius, somewhere around there, depending on the steel that they're using. So maybe a little more, maybe a little less. But 200 is a good place to shoot for. And you try and heat the spine of that knife to just that, not above it, just that, while you're applying counterforce. So if it's bending like this, you want to try and overbend it back like this in the 3-pin jig. So 1 pin here, 1 pin here, 1 pin there. Bend it back the other way and apply that heat, and it will relax the warp out. It's an unfortunate thing to have happen, but when you're rushing, which they have to do in this show, it's a thing that's going to happen.
There you go. Not bad. So Richard just quenched.
I pull out my billet, and there's a warp.
It's not a good time to have a warp.
Okay, so what they did was they stuck the knife in and they held it perfectly still in the oil. And they did keep it in the oil, which is good, like we talked about. But what they didn't do is agitate. And I did mention that before, but what you want to do is up and down movements. So if you have stuck your knife in like this, up and down, not side to side, not like this, up and down movements. And you want to be fairly aggressive with it. The reason for that is because of a cool effect called the Leidenfrost effect, or Leidenfrost effect, depending on, I don't know how you pronounce it. But what happens is if you put a superheated object into a liquid like oil, what can happen is basically a steam jacket will form around it just through the surface tension. A little bubble of vaporized fluid will form around your knife and stay there, which means the oil can't touch your knife and draw away the heat to quench properly. Now this bubble kind of moves and it moves really unpredictably, which means parts of your knife will get quenched at one speed and parts of it will get quenched at another speed. And that leads to warps happening and cracks happening and all sorts of things. So in order to avoid the bubble, it's inevitable. The bubble's going to happen. It's the Leidenfrost effect. It's just a concept in physics. It just happens. When you put it in the oil, you shake it really, really violently, and the motion of the shaking going up and down like this will actually make the bubble sort of slough off and allow the oil to touch your knife. And you want to be very aggressive with it because you want this process to happen very quickly to allow your knife to quench and to make use of that heat. So whenever you quench, always agitate up and down, always, really, really violently. You only need to do it for a few seconds, but yeah, just go crazy with it.
Load that sucker up with Flux and started heating again.
Yeah, okay, so this is one that happens a lot. So if you're not aware of it, when you heat steel, a thing called oxidation happens. So when hot steel meets the air in the atmosphere, it forms a layer of stuff called scale. And blacksmiths and bladesmiths use stuff called flux. And there's lots of different types of flux. But the flux, when you put it on there, creates kind of a barrier between the hot steel and the air so that the scale can't form. However, using this makes forge welding easier in a lot of circumstances, because one of the biggest things that you've got to do during a forge weld is to stop air getting to the mating surfaces. So flux helps with that. But because of this, and people not really understanding fully why they need it, they sort of treat flux like it's magic glue, that whenever there is a delamination, it'll just make forge welds magically happen. And it's just not the case. And I have a video, which I'll link up above, of what I mean when I say that, because what's actually going on when you forge weld is it's a chemical bonding process. So adding too much flux can actually increase your chances of forge welds failing in a big way. I've even seen people do things that are fairly ridiculous by, when they're stacking up their billet of Damascus, they'll put a piece of steel down, then shake flux onto it, and then put another piece down and then shake flux like they're making a sandwich, and then they weld that shut. That's just asking for problems to happen. That's just... But I see people sort of present that sort of thing as if, yeah, I've cracked the code. This is my own little secret technique. No, don't do that. When you apply flux, the amount that, on a normal stacked billet, the amount that's like a penny sprinkled across it, it's all you need. When you apply flux to hot steel, you'll notice that it liquefies and turns into this sort of syrupy, clear, like liquid glass. And you just want enough that that liquid glass is covering all of the places where there's seams. So if you've stacked up your layers, you want that liquid glass to coat all of those seams, and no more. Any more, and you're starting to introduce the risk that flux will flow down in and form these little bubbles, which you see them form in the show a lot. Somebody will be forging away and then they'll see a little bubble form. That's because a pocket of flux has worked its way in there and it can't escape because it's forge welded all around it, but hasn't been squeezed out. So don't overflux. Just also, you know, good quality flux like Shawweld is not cheap. So a jar that big should last a long time. Like I do this full time, man, I don't go through it that fast. It's also really bad for forges to overflux. If you flux just right, you shouldn't be getting flux dripping off your billet into the forge. So yeah, don't overflux.
Risk of cracking your blade.
But guys, Rob just quenched. What do you think of the temperatures?
That was a little hot for me.
Yeah?
Then I pull it out, and it starts to warp. I don't know why it warped, but it warped.
Yeah, all right, so one really clever trick. You can tell that your steel, for most types of steel, you can tell that your steel is ready to quench when the entire thing becomes non-magnetic. It's just after that, but you know, as a general rule, if it's gone non-magnetic a few more seconds in the fire, especially in a triple burner forge that's been running for that long, a few more seconds in the fire and then quench and you're golden. This trips people up though, because steel will become non-magnetic at what's called critical temperature, the Curie temperature of the steel. And that's the point where you need to take action. However, from that point onwards, you can keep heating the steel hotter and hotter and hotter, and it will stay non-magnetic. So a lot of people will pull their knife out, test it with a magnet. This thing's like hotter than the surface of the sun, and they're like, hey, it's non-magnetic. That means it's ready to quench. But no, it was ready to quench about half an hour ago. And now you could use it like a lightsaber. So overheating the steel that much causes that grain growth that we talked about before, and that leads to weak blades, cracking during the quench, massive warps, and critical failure when Jay Nielsen beats it into a giant cube of ice. As you see a lot of failed blades on the show. Quenching that hot when it's just white is dangerous to do. Now, caveat here. A lot of people will say you need to quench it when it's cherry red, or some people say you need to quench it when it's a dull orange. That's a subjective thing, because if I were to be in a pitch black room, critical temperature would look like a sort of a bold cherry red. But if I were in full daylight, if I was standing in the sun and I heated that steel up to what looked like a cherry red, because of the amount of ambient light around me, that could actually be as much as 800 degrees hotter than it was when it was cherry red in the dark room. So the amount of ambient light around you will affect how your eye perceives the color of the steel. So whenever somebody says you need to heat it to this color, just ignore what they say. Just completely ignore it. Because on Forged in Fire, they are under studio lighting. And studio lighting, if you've never been in a film studio, it's very bright. It's very, very bright. Now, you'll hear the judges mention, that's a good color, that's a good color. And those guys would actually know because they sit there day in, day out watching people compete. So they are very used to what the right temperature is under those studio lights. Those guys even go in and compete themselves. So because they see it every episode, they know what the right color is. However, the competitors, they're only in there for the first time, maybe sometimes the second time, and it's very difficult to accurately judge the color, especially in the episodes where they're out in full sun using coal forges. Very easy to overheat your steel because you'll be chasing like a nice forging, bright orange forging heat. But if you're in full sun, a bright orange forging heat is liquefying your steel. So when you go to quench, you need more stable methods of judging that it has reached critical temperature. So with the magnet, you need to be pulling it at intervals and checking it. If it's still magnetic, stick it back in, wait just like 30 seconds more, pull it back in, check it, and as soon as it goes non-magnetic, that's when you quench. You don't just leave it in there until the color looks good, then pull it out and check if it's non-magnetic, because it could have been non-magnetic for ages and be 300 degrees past where you want it to be. Actually, there's some contestants have caught on. It started because of my boy Ting Ting. James from County Line Forge. He was on the show and he used a amazing trick of using table salt, normal, potassium iodide or whatever, table salt, and table salt will go from a solid to a liquid at the temperature of basically non-magnetic, at that Curie temperature, very, very close to it. So he did it because he's colorblind and he can't see the colors at all. So he actually had it in there on his blade, and as soon as that salt melted, he knew into the quench. Brilliant. Very, very clever. And a few contestants have cottoned onto that and started bringing salt with them. That's also a really good way to do it, because you're not going to put it in there, watch the salt melt, and then keep it in there for another 5 minutes. As soon as the salt melts, you're going to pull it out and go like that. It's even more accurate, really, than the magnet test, providing you're using the right type of salt.
I don't think there's any way to fix this right now, and even if there was, I could risk snapping my blade, so I'm just going to let it cool down and then try and grind out as much as I can.
Yeah, okay. That was probably not the best example of this, but this happens every season. I see it maybe 5 or 6 times. It's always wrong. When you have first quenched your knife and you pull it out and it's still really hot and it's in that cooling phase that I was talking about earlier, never, under any circumstances, rest it on its side on your anvil. If you have to put it on your anvil, balance it on its spine. Even put a clamp near the tang and so it stays upright if you have to. And the reason for that is anvils are huge metal heat sinks. And even on the hottest day, touching an anvil will feel pleasantly cool. They are always cold. There's such a large mass of metal that they're just always cold. So when you put a hot blade that's still within a temper range of temperature and still going through its cooling process down flat on an anvil, one side of it, the side that's touching the anvil, is going to be cooling ridiculously faster than the side that's facing up. And so when this goes on, you get warps. And there's been a couple episodes where you can actually see in real time, see the knife bending upwards like a banana because it's sat on the forge. So don't do that. Wait till it cools fully.
Josh, setting his first weld with a hand hammer.
Yeah.
There's a little bit more propensity of weld flaws if you do that. Blades miss!
Yeah, this is one I see quite a bit of. And I highly recommend watching that forge welding video that I linked before. When you're doing what's called setting the billet, and setting the billet is when all of the layers of steel are still separate pieces, and you're trying to do the first fusion to make them into one solid block. You need to do what's called setting passes. And setting passes are very, very light. And if you're doing it with a hammer, it's really little taps. Just tap, 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 tap. Almost like you're, you know, playing a light game, casual game of whack-a-mole. When you hit with a hammer, even a small hammer, very lightly, it's still hitting with quite a bit of force, as anybody will tell you if you've ever gotten your finger under there. You really don't need much force. And when I see people setting a billet by doing full strikes on it, what you're doing is you're squishing it down, and when you squish it down, it also squishes outwards, because steel doesn't disappear, it has to go somewhere. And that outwards movement causes shear stress, because the topmost layers will stretch more than the ones underneath it, and that shear stress will pop your welds open and cause all sorts of problems. So you just want light taps, and you want to do it in a nice spiral motion from the inside to the outside to push all of the flux out from the middle to the edges. If you're doing it on a press, you just want to condense it maybe like 1/4 of an inch of the whole billet, and that's it. And I like to do 3 passes like that, and it really maximizes your chances of setting that billet. If you're hitting it too hard or squishing it too aggressively on something like a power hammer or a press, you're going to create shear stress, which just adds the chance of failure further down the road. So just light passes with a when you're setting that billet.
It's time for me to go into the quench. And I get a giant fireball in my face. It was pretty hot.
Boom. Nice. All right, Ben, in the oil.
Okay, I get it. I get it. The fireball's cool. The fireball makes you feel like a real bladesmith when you go to quench and then you get the fireball. So much so that people really try and go for it. I'm sorry to tell you that the ideal quench is one where no fireball happens. Sometimes they happen accidentally. Sometimes they do. What happens is you'll notice when people quench, a huge amount of really thick smoke comes out. That smoke is not smoke. It's actually vapor. And it's vaporized oil of whatever you're quenching in. And it is extremely flammable. Like, it's really, the tiniest spark will set that off. So it's quite dangerous if you're in an enclosed space, because it's just one tiny spark and that's all it takes. So if you slide your hot knife in and you're under the level of the oil, like there's the level of the oil, and you put it in and you're under and you're going to agitate normally, that massive plume of smoke's coming. If you pull it out too quick and that steel is hot enough still, because you haven't left it in there long enough, that heat is enough to ignite that vapor and you get the fireball. So, like I said, sometimes it can happen accidentally. You could be, heating your knife up and a big section of the tang is also glowing red. So when you quench the blade, maybe you left a bit of the handle out and that caught it. It can happen accidentally. People are rushing. Not everybody that does the fireball on the show is doing it wrong. But some people stick it in and then pull it out while there's still a red glow in the knife, and that red glow ignites the fireball. And ideally you don't want fireball. You want to stick it in so fast that the vapor that forms never has a chance to ignite. And that's how you know you've done a good quench, because you've just gone, every part of the knife has been able to quench at the same time, and you're agitating to remove the Leidenfrost effect. That's a good quench. The fireball, and especially deliberately sticking it in and then deliberately pulling it out while it's still glowing to get like a big drippy fireball, it looks great on television, especially in the glorious slow motion shots. The cinematography of Forged in Fire is just, it's so entertaining to watch. I get it. It looks super cool. It makes you feel super cool. It's incorrect technique. I'm just gonna say it. I'm really sorry about that one, because I love a good fireball too. And I've deliberately done it for videos, like my anvil, the ad I did for Beamish anvils. I love my Beamish anvil. And I wanted that ad to be as dramatic as possible. So I deliberately did a fireball for it in slow motion, just because it looks like $1 million. It's so cool. But yeah, it's not right. You keep it in there below the level of the oil.
Little twist.
I do see a small twist at the tip of the blade, so I'm going to try to straighten it out with light taps There's definitely a risk to doing that because now there could be cracking as a result. I hope this decision doesn't have any major lashback.
Okay, this is the last one I'm going to talk about for the video. We've talked about how to correct warps in a previous segment. Never, ever try and correct a warp by hitting it with a hammer, even lightly. Just don't do that. It will put stress cracks through your blade. Think of it, when you first quench a blade, think of it like it's a shard of glass that's in the shape of a knife. Would you hit it with a hammer? You would not. You would expect it to break if you hit a shard of glass with a hammer. You'd be surprised if it didn't. So don't do it with your knife. Yeah, use the have a straightening jig ready post quench, or use 3-pin method with temperatures. That's the way to correct a warp. Don't hit it with a hammer. So that's it, guys. Let me know if you enjoyed this. Like, I have to admit, I've been agonizing over doing this video for a while now, probably about 6 months, because I don't want people to take it as me, you know, having a shot at the show or the contestants. Like, I love the show. I think it's awesome, and I encourage everybody that makes knives to watch it just because it is a damn good watch. It's really genuinely entertaining, and I look forward to seeing it every time. And like I said, the contestants that are on there, often not to blame because they're rushing, understandably, because they've got a time limit, so they're going to cut a lot of corners. And B, the show is heavily edited. Like, they have a 3-hour first round and like a 2 or 3 hour second round, and then 5 days at home, and they have to condense all that into 45 minutes. So they're going to edit out a lot of things. So the main takeaway here is don't take the show as an educational show. Don't use it as an educational show. Use it to inspire you and get your vim going for making knives, but find educational channels to learn things. Don't take your education from the show, because there's so many things that are done wrong and presented wrong on that show out of necessity that you don't want to take as an education, because it will mess with you. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll catch you all in the next video. Bye.
Turning hand in hand to the comforts of the past, past the merry reflection